Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Heinous Beliefs, where we dive deep into the dark intersections of faith and crime. I'm your host, Ria, and as always, I appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. Seriously, y'all showing up every week means everything to me. But before we get into today's case, I gotta give y'all a heads up. This episode gets intense, so again, listener discretion is advised, okay? Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Make sure that you know what episodes you would like to skip. You know your limits, okay? So if that's not your thing today, I totally get it. Please take care of yourselves. Again, if you're going to be sticking around, listener discretion is advised. Okay, that being said, if you're going to be sticking around, go ahead and grab your coffee, grab your tea, get your eyes on the road, buckle up, whatever you need to do. Let's get into it. Today we're talking about Ervil LeBaron, a man who claimed to be God's chosen prophet, but ended up leading a deadly cult, leaving a trail of blood and destruction. His story is wild. We've got sibling rivals, power struggles, secret heists, and even murders carried out years after his death. If you think cult leaders are dangerous while they're alive, just wait till you hear what happens when Ervil's followers kept killing long after he was gone. So Ervil LeBaron was born in 1925 in Chihuahua, Mexico, into a family of fundamental Mormons. And when I say fundamental, I mean these were people who broke away from mainstream Mormonism because they wanted to keep practicing polygamy. Yeah, that old school many wives, God told me I can kind of thing. That's what they wanted. But here's the thing, this wasn't just about having multiple wives. This was about power, control, and a dangerous obsession with religious authority. Ervil was one of many siblings, but even as a kid, he stood out. He was smart, ambitious, and had a way with words. But he also had this streak of ruthlessness that set him apart from other kids. His family saw him as an intense, charismatic, but manipulative person. It was clear early on that he wasn't going to follow the family doctrine, he was going to create his own. By the 1950s, Ervil and his brother Joel had taken his father's teachings and formed their own church, the Church of the Firstborn of the Faithful of Times. Again, y'all, with these names, look, when I say I'm gonna be clowning the hell out of y'all, if anyone were to approach me with some cult and it had one of these weirdo names, which they usually do, I'm just gonna burst out laughing. Like, listen to this name again, okay? It is the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Time. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's a mouthful. But what's important is that this wasn't just a church, it was a battleground. Because even though Joel was technically the leader, Ervil wasn't a kind of guy to play second fiddle to anyone, not even his own brother, okay? And that's where the power struggle started. Joel preached peace, but Ervil was all about dominance and violence. He believed in order to truly serve God, their church had to rule over others as well. And anyone who stood in his way, well, let's just say he had a plan for that too. What started off as ideological differences between two brothers quickly turned into outright conflict. Ervil began secretly recruiting his own followers, whispering in their ears that he was the real prophet and that Joel was weak and unfit to lead. And if you know anything about cults, you know that when a leader starts calling himself the true prophet, things are about to go off the rails, okay? But Joel wasn't backing down. He was the rightful leader of the church by his father, right, technically, and he wasn't about to let Ervil undermine him. For a while, he tried to coexist, because he's one of the ones that are preaching peace and love and, prosperity. Everything is good, kumbaya. But Ervil was never going to settle for sharing power. For a while, they tried to coexist, two brothers, both preaching from the same book, but with very different ideas of what the words meant. He wanted it all. He was willing to spill blood to get it. That's when things turned deadly. So let's talk about the moment where things really took a turn. In 1972, Ervil's brother Joel was shot and killed. And guess who ordered it? Yep, Ervil. This dude really had his own brother murdered because he thought he was the rightful leader of their church. And what makes it even wilder is Joel saw it coming, okay? In the months leading up to his murder, he knew Ervil was gunning for him, literally. He even told someone in his group that if anything happened to him, Ervil was behind it. And sure enough, he was ambushed in Mexico, shot dead in cold blood, and Ervil took over as leader, of course, convinced that this was all a part of some kind of divine prophecy, even though you're the one that got him assassinated, right? He says this is some kind of divine prophecy. Believing that, Ervil took over as leader, convinced that this was all a part of some divine prophecy. But it wasn't just about taking out Joel. This was just the beginning of a full-blown killing spree. Once Ervil had tasted power, he wasn't going to stop. In 1977, he set his sights on Roland C. Alfred, another polygamous leader who honestly had nothing to do with him. Alfred was minding his own business, running his own sect, and Irvin still saw him as a threat. In his own twisted mind, only one prophet could exist, and sure as hell wasn't gonna let anyone but him be that prophet. So what did he do? He sent two of his most loyal followers, women by the way, to pose as seekers of spiritual guidance. They walked right into Alfred's office in Salt Lake City, got close, and boom, gunned him down in front of his own people. It was so cold-blooded, so calculated, that the worst part, Ervil wasn't even there. He had his hands clean, right? But his words pulled that trigger. And those weren't the only ones. Over the years, Ervil ordered hits on anyone he saw as a threat. And when I say ordered, I don't mean he whispered it in a few words to a few followers. I mean he wrote entire manifestos, like hit lists disguised as holy revelations. Imagine that though, your name showing up in a sacred book as someone who had to be removed to please God. The scariest part was his followers carried out without question. And this is why it's hard for me to have empathy for some of these cult members, right? Because we get when somebody's brainwashed, we understand. You kind of don't have any control about your thoughts at that point because you're brainwashed. But for these people that would just, willingly cause people pain just because a random man says it, I'm sorry, I can't feel empathy for you because you are the enforcer here, okay? One of the most infamous examples was the murder of Dean Vest, a former follower who tried to break free from Ervil's grip. He thought he was safe, but Ervil had a long memory. 1977, just months after Alfred's assassination, Vest was shot to death in front of his wife and kids. And it wasn't a random attack, it was a message that leaving Ervil's church meant signing your own death warrant. And we're not done yet because Ervil was a step ahead. He knew that he couldn't order these murders forever, so before he died, he put it all in writing, a full list of names, a guidebook for killings, a holy doctrine that his followers took as law, and trust me, it didn't die with him. But we'll get there soon, okay? Now let's talk about the peoples whose lives were shattered by Ervil's madness. Imagine growing up in a world where asking questions meant risking your life. That's what life looked like for the kids in Ervil's sect. They weren't just raised in a strict religious household. They were conditioned to fear everything outside of their community. School, not allowed. Making friends from outsiders, not allowed. Forbidding outside of the community. And worst of all, questioning Ervil, that was a death sentence. Rebecca LeBaron, one of his nieces, later recalled how deeply ingrained the fear was. If you questioned the doctrine, this is her speaking, if you questioned the doctrine, you were told you were putting your soul at risk. I remember the whispers about people disappearing. Kids would wake up one day and realize a familiar face was just gone, and no one ever had an explanation as to why. And then there's Kristen Alfred, the daughter of Rulon C. Alfred, who was just a teenager when her father was murdered. I collapsed. My world was shattered. He wasn't just a religious leader, he was my dad. Imagine being a teenager sitting in class thinking about what movie you want to watch that night, and then boom, you get called into the office and told that your father has been assassinated. That was Christian's reality. Her father wasn't involved in Irvin's cult, but that didn't matter. Irvin saw him as a threat and he wanted to eliminate that threat, so he targeted him and killed him. But it wasn't just high profile religious leaders and their families that suffered. Regular members of the church lived in constant terror. Some women were forced into marriages as young as 14. Okay, obviously there are women now that we're talking about it, but back then they were forced into the marriage as early as 10, 14. Their fates decided by Ervil and his inner circle. If they refused, well, let's just say there are reports of accidents happening to people who did not comply. Other people who tried to leave were hunted down, and some were dragged back to the community against their will. One of the most disturbing stories comes from the former member Heinous LeBaron, one of Ervil's own daughter. She managed to escape, but before witnessing firsthand the brainwashing, violence, physical torment, psychological torment that shaped her childhood. In her memoir, The Polygamist Daughter, she described how she grew up constantly moving, constantly hiding from law enforcement, and always fearing that someone, maybe even her own family, would turn on her. Now, here's where the story takes an even crazier turn. In 1979, Ervil finally got caught and was sentenced to life in prison. That would be the end of it, right? You would think that's where it would end. No. He died in 1981, but before he died, he wrote what's now called the Book of the New Covenant. Basically, it was his murder Bible, pages of names of people he wanted dead, instructions of how to kill them, and the justification for each one. His followers, they actually followed through with it. Okay? Again, I can't have empathy for people like this, y'all. I don't have it. I don't have it. This so-called holy hit list was taken as law amongst the devoted members, right? These believers of this man. These weren't just casual followers. They were brainwashed into thinking Ervil's death was just another step in God's plan and their job was to carry out the divine justice. Think about how deep the kind of control has to run. This man has been dead for years and his followers are still trying his words on people. Like he's quite literally asking them to kill people from the grave, and they're fulfilling it. Fast forward to 1988, and we get what's known as the 4 o'clock murders. On June 27 at exactly 4 p.m., teams of assassins executed a serial coordinated attack across Texas, targeting former members who had deflected. This wasn't just random, okay? This wasn't some random act of violence. This was a calculated effort to eliminate anyone Ervil had labeled as a traitor. Even though he wasn't even alive anymore, the victims included Ed Marston, a former follower who had tried to break free and expose the group, and another ex-member who had spoken against Ervil's teachings. Authorities were stunned. How do you prosecute crimes orchestrated by a man who's been dead for decades? This case shook law enforcement to its core because it showed just how strong cult conditioning can be. Investigators found that Ervil's Book of the New Covenant had been passed around like a sacred relic, guiding these murders as if they were fulfilling some divine prophecy. And get this, there were still more names on that list. Some defectors went into hiding, terrified at any moment, one that Ervil's loyals are going to come and find them knocking on the door, or Ervil himself would come and kill them. Some even changed their identities completely, just escaping from the reach of this man, right? Obviously now he's dead, but they're still scared. This was no ordinary cult fallout, okay? This was the ghost of Ervil LeBaron pulling the strings from the grave. proving that a charismatic leader's influence doesn't just disappear when they die. It lingers, infecting generations, and in this case, leaving a body count that continued long after his death. By the early 90s, law enforcement finally started piecing things together, but it wasn't easy. Ervil's cult operated in secrecy, crossing state and national borders, making arrests and convictions incredibly difficult. His followers weren't just scattered, they were deeply embedded in secretive communities that still followed his twisted ideology. Some of them disappeared entirely, using fake names, moving between Mexico and the US, and living off the grid in a polygamous compound. For years, law enforcement struggled to track members who were still following the commands from Ervil's so-called Book of the New Covenant. Some of his most devoted believers were practically ghosts, hidden by their own families and fellow cultists. The big break came when authorities started flipping former cult members who were too scared to keep running. Some of them had been living in fear for years, waiting for a hit squad to come after them next. But as the legal net started to tighten, a few defectors started cooperating, providing key testimonies about Ervil's criminal empire. His own children were involved in carrying out his murders. Some of them born into the cult were brainwashed from childhood and never knew any other way of life. They genuinely believed that they were doing God's work, even when it meant pulling the trigger on your own relatives. In 1993, investigators arrested several of Ervil's children and close relatives. Finally, some justice for the families of the victims. Among those convicted was Ervil LeBaron, one of Ervil's sons who had been instrumental in continuing the cult's violence legacies. I'm going to pause here really quick and just give a bit of a think piece, right? I don't think people realize how deep, right, these kinds of beliefs can go. And again, that's why Heinous Beliefs is here, is because like no one is having these conversations, right? We just brush it off as, oh yeah, they were just super religious, blah, 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 blah. But when these cults are formed, right, it's not just like a family tradition. It's not just like, oh, every Sunday we have dinner and we talk about the Bible, blah, 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 or we talk about the Quran, or we talk about whatever spiritual beliefs we have. That's usually not how it goes, right? It's not as mediocre as that. It's not as subtle as that. Like, obviously, yes, there's some families that just keep it personal, blah, 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 blah. But my gripe here, my problem here is when you guys start off these cults, when these people start these cults, I wonder why you now have to bother other people, right? This is your personal belief. If your family is partaking in it, great. You do it in the comfort of your own home. Now, the whole idea of needing to now cause harm to other people is where I'm disconnecting, right? Like this whole idea of belief and religion and spirituality and all that nonsense. And I'm saying nonsense because I don't see the necessity for it. I don't see the reason for it, right? There's so many other things in life. There's so many other things that our brains are capable of that are more sustainable than belief. So that's why we'll call it nonsense, right? Because it's making people do things like this, that even after decades of this man being dead, they're still targeting people. They're still causing havoc. They're still killing people. Like, obviously, yes, indoctrination, brainwashing, I get it. But again, this is the effect of belief. Because guess what? You can believe anything. There's no true belief. There's no exact belief. There's no rule book as to say, oh, this is the correct one. This is the right one. This is how you know you're believing the right way. Everyone comes up with their own idea of what they think belief should be or what they think you should be believing in. And that is enough reason for me to say, then you should be doing it in the comfort of your own home, because this all sounds like personal experience. You don't need to now cause havoc on other people's lives because of something that you believe in. That part will never make sense to me. It will never make sense to me. Right? Like, why do you need to go hurt other people for your imaginary God? Right? Because at this point, it just sounds like you want to hurt people and you just need a God covering or some justification for it. And it's not even a justification, it's just a covering. Right? When society hears about stuff like this, it's very much brushed off, right? No one really wants to talk more about it because, one, it's taboo to talk about how these cults are mimicking mainstream religion. They are mimicking the religions that we all bow down to today. Right? We have all these big mega churches. We have all these big mega institutions. We have the imams that are literally living life as lavish as they possibly can while people are suffering in their communities, right? But no one wants to talk about stuff like that. The child marriages that happen in these religions and these beliefs. We just brush, oh, well, that's just a religious belief. That's just, no. If it's just their religious beliefs, it should be limited to just you. Just you and your so-called personal experiences. No one else should be hearing about it. No one else should have to suffer for whatever the hell you got going on. It's never going to make sense to me. I'm sorry. Okay? It's not. Anyway, the court proceedings expose how deeply the cult's ideologies had been drilled into its members. Many of them still believed that they were carrying out God's will, even as they stood at trial for murder. Prosecutors presented evidence showing how Ervil's scriptures were still being read like sacred text, and how new generations were being groomed to take over the killing missions. The depth of control Ervil had over his people were staggering. It went beyond brainwashing, okay? As more arrests were made, more horrifying details emerged. It turned out that after Ervil's death, his followers had continued holding secret meetings, training young men as soldiers of their holy war, quote unquote. They had weapons stashed in different compounds, and their community systems was so tight-knit that even law enforcement struggled to infiltrate it. Some of these followers had gone years without contact with the outside world, completely cut off from reality, living in an alternate universe where Ervil's world was still law. And even with this isolation, again, okay, because I know we're going to say brainwash, yes, I understand. But even in this isolation, the doctrine is still saying, go and kill other people outside of the community. So this isolation doesn't really seem to be doing anything for anybody else but them. By the time the damage had already been done, over 25 people were dead, and the countless others had lived lives destroyed by one man's obsession with power. Even after Ervil was long gone, his twisted ideologies left scars, and these scars would never fully heal. Survivors of the cult spent years unlearning the fear and control they had grown up with, while families of victims were left to pick up the pieces, knowing that the man responsible for their suffering had been able to manipulate people from beyond the grave. Here are some of the convictions that the members of the LeBaron family got. There was Vonda White, one of Ervil's many wives. She went down for murdering a guy named Dean Grover Vest because he wanted to leave the cult. She got life in prison. Mark Chinwet was shot at his office in Houston. Dwayne Chinwet and his 8-year-old daughter, Jennifer, were murdered while running errands. And for the 4 o'clock murders, there were 7 people involved in these killings. 5 of them were convicted, and one was Cynthia LeBaron. She flipped on the rest of them and got immunity, so she was exempt from the conviction. But the last one, Jacqueline LeBaron, dipped out and stayed hidden for years until the feds finally caught her in 2010. She pled guilty to conspiracy and got 5. Ervil's son, Herbert LeBaron, he took over his father when he died and ended up serving life in prison for his role in the murders. Another one of his sons, Aaron LeBaron, was convicted in 1997 for running the hit squad, and he got slapped with 45 years in prison. Ervil had his people out here running a whole assassination ring in the name of God, but the law caught up with them real quick, okay? Even today, some of Ervil's teachings still linger in these offshoots cults. Proof that once a cult leader plants an idea in people's heads, it can take generations to fully root out. There's still whispers of hidden LeBaron followers who believe in blood atonement and continue to pass down Ervil's twisted doctrines in secret. If not for anything, this shows that blind faith is never going to be a good thing. The difference now is law enforcement is watching closely, determined to make sure that his reign of terror never happens again. But they are unable to even guarantee that, because at this point they're just waiting for when the murders happen. Not only if they will happen, but when they will happen, because the LeBaron family is not like done yet, right? There's still some offshoots. There's still some people out there that still believe in this doctrine, that still have copies of his book, especially this evil battle that they're supposed to be fighting. When people feel like they're fighting for something, it's kind of hard to get them out of their mindset, right? So I'm wondering if there is more of a reactive measure being made here rather than a proactive one, which I think it should be proactive. But it seems like law enforcement rather do reactive work on this instead of proactive, which I understand because a lot of them are off the grid. A lot of them know how to live without the common necessities of regular society, right? They've been conditioned to being able to live off the land, live off the grid, and still commit these murders. So I get it. I get why the approach is more reactive, but I honestly still think that these cults and establishments should be taken a little bit more seriously and should be treated as a threat rather than waiting to see what they do before you realize that they're gonna be causing havoc to society, right? All right, y'all, that's the case of Ervil, one of the most terrifying cult leaders you've probably ever heard of. If this story gave you chills, share it with someone else that loves true crime. And if you want more cases like this, make sure to subscribe. Keep tuning in every week. Follow whatever platform you're listening on. And we'll be back next Friday. Until next time, stay safe, question everything, and don't drink the Kool-Aid, y'all. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. You don't even need it for real. Go drink water, okay? See y'all next episode. Bye.